Hey everybody, this is an essay entitled Between Vietnam and Israel, The Dilemma of Political Commitment, published in 1967 by Jean Améry. As coincidence would have it, a couple of weeks ago, the author of this contribution had the opportunity to speak with a few days of each other speak within a few days of each other with the German writers Alfred Anders and Rolf Schurz about the political commitment of the intellectual. Implicitly, they were all more or less in agreement that this commitment could only be, in the widest sense of the word, and however problematically so, leftist in nature. The former officer Schurz, temperamentally a conservative and a member of the FDP, which is an acronym for the Liberal Free Democratic Party founded in 1948. In the 1950s, the party opposed the denazification process and swelled its ranks with numerous former Nazis, including SS members. The footnote here says, Alfred Anders, 1914 to 1980, served as a communist official in 1932 to 33 and was imprisoned in Dachau for 6 months in 1933. Called up in 1943, he deserted in 1944. After the war, he became one of the most influential West German writers. He moved to Switzerland in 1958. Rolf Schurz was a Nazi officer during the Second World War and later became a successful German writer. He played a vital role in the FDP and stood for election to parliament. Okay, so end of footnotes. The former officer Schurz, temperamentally a conservative and a member of the FDP, albeit on the left of the party, the former young communist Anders, and the leftist, in every sense of the word, homeless author of these lines, in keeping with the tradition which has prevailed since the Dreyfus affair, it went without saying for all three of them that an intellectual who becomes politically active by definition does so on the left, where, to quote Alfred Polgar, quote, the heart of humanity beats, end quote. Footnote. Polgar made this remark in a piece on Georges de la Fachardière, published in Schwarz auf Weiß in 1929. End footnote. Beyond this tacit agreement, however, certain problems presented themselves. Did an intellectual not give up his political freedom by associating himself all too closely with political events? Did he not limit his ability to adhere to the critical virtue of tolerance by committing himself? Was it permissible to judge every domestic German problem from a leftist position and to use each and every barely appropriate opportunity to take to the stage and speak out? What happened to the authorial dignity of, say, Günter Grass, as he traversed the German lands in his role as the bard of the SPD? SPD, for most of you will know, in this footnote it says, SPD is the acronym for the center-left Social Democratic Party of Germany, initially founded in 1863. End footnote. Did the intellectual not jeopardize his authority and diminish the impact of his words by signing an endless stream of protest telegrams and manifestos? The discussion did not lead to any definite conclusion. I, for my part, to introduce under stylistic and moral duress, the personal pronoun one ordinarily likes to hide behind, bashful circumlocution, and feigned detachment and objectivity, I then, for my part, in the face of my interlocutor's reservations, argue with some passion for the merits of political commitment. The concerns regarding the authority of the author is his, quote, aura, end quote. The concerns regarding the authority of the author, his, quote, aura, end quote, were not really that important, I suggested. Even the, quote, beauty of the more or less beautiful words with which the writers enchanted their readers, one should not take all too seriously. Nor, as one could deduce from Herbert Marcuse's magnificent essay, Repressive Tolerance, did tolerance constitute an absolute historical or moral value? Sartre's activities were a case in point. Not only did he not fear a loss of authority should he speak out, even the possibility that he might make a fool of himself did not deter him. There were always plausible and obvious priorities, and one of them was the commitment to a cause, which might not be a genuine good cause yet, but would, as opposed to others, seem to have the potential of one day becoming one. The proponent of left-leaning commitment and had no great difficulties in arguing the case he was inclined and felt enjoined to make. He referred to Vietnam. There, a small people was being crushed by the world's strongest military machine. In no way could one suggest that a symmetry existed between the atrocities perpetrated by either side, as though both were equally guilty. Or one might think of Greece, he pointed out, where the new order and the new morality were on the march. Yet come the holiday season next summer, few archaeologically interested cultural tourists would give it a miss. Or of Bolivia. There, one had apparently already tortured the young French philosopher Regis Debray, a dazzling human being of stirring physical and intellectual prowess, half to death, and it is still a distinct possibility that he might be executed, regardless of what the general who was his president thought. Footnote. In the event, Debray was released in December 1970. End footnote. Actually, he added, Regis Debray's case gave a fairly clear indication of the meaningful nature of political commitment, which always came into its own at the point at which the committed intellectual was able to bring his actions into full agreement with his words, when he was physically engaged in the implementation of goals he had spoken and written about. Nor did this commitment in any way contradict the protest that had to be raised against the despicable treatment of men like Soviet writers Daniel and Zenyavsky. Footnote. Yuli Markovich Daniel, 1925 to 1988, and Andrei Donatovich Sinyavsky, 1925 to 1997, were arrested in September 1965 and tried and convicted the following year for anti-Soviet propaganda. Their case caused considerable international consternation. Following their release in 1970 and 1971 respectively, Daniel worked as a translator in the Soviet Union, while Sinyavsky moved to Paris in 1973, where he subsequently held a chair at the Sorbonne. End footnote. After all, they and their afflicted peers in the countries of the socialist bloc saw themselves as being engaged in leftist oppositional activity targeting a right-wing reactionary orthodoxy. Their misfortune only underscored further that the intellectual continues to stand on the left, while the might, which is evil even when it tries to be good, and despite being rooted in a theory predicated on right and justice, is located squarely on the political right. All other things being given that U Thant saw the world being propelled straight to the Third World War in Vietnam, you should always look to Vietnam to gain a sense of direction. Footnote. The Burmese politician and diplomat U Thant, 1909 to 1974, was the third Secretary General of the United Nations from 1962 to 1971. End footnote. What direction should be was a matter of dispute. Indeed, this was an irreconcilably contested issue. Yet no one could opt for agreeable, quote, objectivity, end quote, in the matter. The situation was this straightforward. From the perspective of the intellectual interested in political commitment, the current political situation really did cut such an overly obvious figure. One could not but give the terrible simplificator, overcoming all fear of mockery, for the horrors of the world were indeed this straightforward. Translation of that French word that I just butchered is terrible simplifier. End footnote. Yet then something transpired that, for the author who is telling the truth about himself in this article and for thousands of others who are of like mind, transformed the horrific simplicity of the political landscape into an even more horrifying complicacy. Horrifying complicacy. The Arab states supported by the Soviet Union and the entire socialist bloc seemed to be on the verge of snuffing out the tiny state of Israel. Against this backdrop, Claude Lanzmann, a member of the Sartre, quote, family, end quote, who accompanied Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir on their recent trip to Egypt and Israel, declared that, as a socialist and Marxist, he was now compelled to nail his flag unreservedly to the mast of this state, which in the parlance of the socialist bloc is a bridgehead of American imperialism in the Middle East. He regretted, Lanzmann added, that he had not professed this unambiguous commitment sooner. What had happened to Sartre's student and friend had likewise happened to the author of this contribution, on whom Sartre has had a great formative influence than any other philosopher. Has had a greater formative influence than any other philosopher. And it surely must happen to innumerable other people too, who, by opting for the Vietnamese cause, had opted for themselves, ranging from Jewish leftists of some obscure socialist denomination to maybe Howard Levy, the Jewish colonel and physician who refused to instruct U.S. recruits destined for Vietnam because, quote, as a man of Jewish extraction, end quote, he did not want to serve the Hitler fan Marshal Kai. Footnote. Nguyen Cao Kai, 1930 to 2011, was the chief of the South Vietnam Air Force and later became Prime Minister of South Vietnam from 1965 to 1967. End footnote. Only weeks before this event, I had still been able to see myself in a straightforward way as one of those leftist intellectuals who, in a manner tempered by their critical habitus and self-mockery, indulged the revulsion of some while offering a measure of gratification to themselves and others. I recall participating in the Nuremberg colloquy, which took place in April 1967. Footnote. The Nuremberg colloquies initiated by Nuremberg's municipal head of cultural affairs, Hermann Glaser, a social democrat, took place between 1965 and 1969 and drew fierce right-wing criticism. At the first colloquy in 1965, Fritz Bauer discussed the relevance of Auschwitz, inter alia, with H.G. Adler. End footnote. There, a young German wearing a traditional jacket a la Heidegger, who was so enraged that all the blood had drained from his face, made it known that, in the fullness of time, one would know where to find figures like me. I can still sense the childlike pride that took hold of me in that moment, given that, even for the likes of me, one's political commitment was evidently no longer an entirely empty gesture, and one could console oneself with the thought that it entailed at least a minimum of risk. Yet the massing of Arab troops on all of Israel's borders had to cut off, the partly self-righteous and in any case intellectually not exactly well-founded gratification drawn from this form of political commitment, which one used to call, quote, anti-fascist, end quote. Leaving to one side all the obviously nonsensical possible points of comparison, what set me apart from Sartre in this situation, or from Enzensberger, and all the other committed leftist intellectuals for whom the existence of the State of Israel is a, quote, cause, to be sure, but not one that concerns their own place in the world. Footnote. Hans Magnus Enzensberger, born 1929, is an extremely influential and well-connected, formerly West German literary figure. Worlds set us apart. Regardless of whether we are entirely of Jewish extraction or not, whether we are religious or totally assimilated atheists, now that Israel is under threat, those of us who have been compelled to recognize that we bear the Jewish lot have been expelled from the community of which we were a part only yesterday. Those of us who belong to the generation that experienced Hitler's crimes in the flesh find ourselves as isolated once again as we were between 1933 and 1945. We no longer have a choice. We can no longer choose ourselves, because we have already been chosen as victims, and there is some likelihood that we will once more have to play the role that was thrust on us back then. The singular and irreducible core of the Jewish condition is now becoming clear. It is the inescapability of being a Jew, a state one can only accept and whose implications are ineluctable. One may want to be a leftist intellectual one day, but no longer the next. This is almost entirely a matter of free will. Being a Jew, by contrast, and I repeat, regardless of whether one is a religious Jew, entirely of Jewish extraction, or in, quote, racial, end quote, terms of mixed descent, is a priori not a matter of choice. The Jew is compelled to stay who he is and must accept that it is so. And this will be also determine his stance on the looming Israeli-Arab conflict. I have before me the text of an appeal issued by leftist French intellectuals calling for peace in the Middle East. It refers to the friendship between the signatories and the Arab people, and emphatically rejects American imperialism. It then expressly pleads Israel's case. The security and sovereignty of the state, including its freedom of shipping, needed to be protected. Peace should be achieved in direct negotiations between the nations concerned and serve their peoples. The appeal is well-meaning and seeks to do justice to all parties. Since it is abundantly clear that the Arab states do not wish to negotiate, and are under no circumstances minded to acknowledge Israel's right to exist, the appeal is also entirely theoretical in nature. That Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Claude Roy, Jean Cassou, Abbé Morel, and Pastor Westphal signed the document is understandable and should be countenanced. The lack of realism on the part of its authors reflected in the text notwithstanding. Footnote: Claude Roy, 1915 to 1997, was a writer, journalist, and translator who joined the Communist Party during the Second World War. Having reported on events in Hungary in 1956, he subsequently moved away from communism. Claude Roy opposed the war in Algeria and was one of the signatories of the Manifesto of the 121. Jean Cassou, 1897 to 1986, was a writer and art historian who fought in the resistance and was imprisoned by the Vichy regime. From 1945 to 1965, he was the director of the National Museum of Modern Art. Yankelevich was his brother-in-law. Abbé Maurice Morel, 1908 to 1991, was, alongside his priesthood, an abstract painter and stained glass artist. Charles Westphal, 1896 to 1972, was a leading French Calvinist and played a prominent role in shaping his denomination's attitude toward Jewish-Christian relations. End footnote. After all, given that their existence is not at stake, non-Jewish intellectuals can afford to reaffirm their political and moral principles in this situation. However, that the Jews Laurent Schwartz, Vladimir Yankelevich, and Clara Malraux Goldschmidt also put their names to the writ takes us into the realm of a tragic kind of irony. Footnote: Laurent Moise Schwartz was a mathematician and recipient of the Fields Medal in 1950, not least following the, quote, disappearance, end quote, of his graduate student Maurice Aldin in Algiers in 1957. Schwartz became a vocal opponent of the war in Algeria and was temporarily suspended from his professorship at the École Polytechnique because he had signed the Manifesto of the 121. Clara Malraux, née Goldschmidt, 1897 to 1982, was a writer, translator, inter alia, of Virginia Woolf, Franz Kafka, and Siegfried Kracauer, and memoirist. She was the first wife of André Malraux. They divorced during the war. End footnote. They are cleaving to principles that have become self-contradictory and that reality has rendered obsolete. What is the point of professing one's friendship with the Arab people when they are quite obviously not interested in this declaration of love and would quite unceremoniously treat the philosopher Yankelevich, the mathematician Schwartz, and the writer Clara Malraux in an extremely inclement manner, given half a chance? What is the point, in this context, of condemning American imperialism? To be sure, it exists, or to be more precise, America absolutely is pursuing a policy of belligerent violence in Vietnam. But this has nothing to do with the crisis in the Middle East, where it is, after all, not the Americans who are threatening to wipe out a small country. It would seem that the leftist Jewish intellectuals have not yet grasped fully that in the face of what is occurring on Israel's borders, their leftist comportment becomes meaningless. They are in for a rude awakening when they are confronted with the incontrovertible fact that they are in no position to choose or take a stance because they have already been chosen and put in their place. Why so? Well, the matter is straightforward enough. For every single Jew the world over, whatever his political orientation, whether he is an intellectual or a businessman or a craftsman, the existence of the small Jewish state is a, quote, existential, end quote, issue, because not only have the Jews in Israel, to use the formulation of Ernst Bloch, coined in another context, themselves acquired the, quote, upright gait, end quote. They have also taught the Jews who live in the diaspora and may have no intention of ever going to Israel, not even on holiday, how to adopt a firm step and straight posture. The state of Israel has so resoundingly disproved the most stupid anti-Semitic legends that the Jews were cowards, that they knew what to do with a banknote but now not how to operate a plow, that they were incapable of forming a state, that even the most dogged old Nazi or neo-Nazi no longer dares repeat them. Every Jew, no matter where he lives off this achievement, even if he has long since constituted himself as wholly French or wholly American. It gives him a proper place in the world, whether he admits this to himself or not. Thus, the leftist Jewish intellectual is enlisted by, and turned over to, his lot. He has not freely elected his commitment. It has been thrust on him under inescapable duress. Since hostile armies have amassed around Israel, since the most forthright voices in the Arab lands have let it be known that the small country should be turned into a large concentration camp, since there is talk of driving the Israelis into the sea, he is no longer a leftist intellectual but merely a Jew. For Auschwitz lies behind him, and the hope for Auschwitz too, on the Mediterranean, may well lie ahead of his brethren, from whom he cannot remove himself, because the world will not let him. As it has done once before, the Jewish condition humane has, by tragic means, relieved the Jew of this choice, which is not to deny that, as a leftist, he is faced with an awful dilemma. After all, the conflict in Vietnam goes on. The escalation has not been halted. Vietnam's plight is real and continues to demand the solidarity of leftist Jews. And this even though Hanoi has assured Nasser by telegram of its unreserved approval. How can one escape this dilemma? One can simplify the matter by constructing a hypothetical case, asking what would follow if both General Giap and Itzhak Rabin, in his capacity as Chief of Staff, were to begin recruiting volunteers and forming international brigades. Footnote: Vo Nguyen Giap, 1912 to 2013, was the North Vietnamese Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, and Commander-in-Chief. End footnote. Where, then, should a young leftist Jew who is fit for military service head? This may look like something of a conundrum, yet assuming the young person presented with this choice wants to opt for authenticity, its solution is in fact predetermined. For the author of this contribution, this issue is already settled. His age and physical constitution allowing him, he would place himself at Robin's disposal and, quote, betray, end quote, General Giap, even if this did bring with it the risk of suddenly finding himself fighting, while under Israeli command, side by side with an American Marine who may well have been involved in the awful combat in Vietnam only a moment ago, and who might even be a segregationist and anti-Semite back home in South Carolina. The dilemma of the leftist Jewish intellectual is purely psychological in nature. Objectively, his conduct is already predetermined. In other words, once again, he is not free, no more than the author of these lines was when in 1941 he joined the resistance. After all, even if he had been, quote, loyal, end quote, to the German occupation authorities, he would still have been deported. Consequently, he is intellectually no longer interested in resolving the conundrums of political commitment. As long as Israel, and he himself and his arduously acquired upright gait with it, are under threat, the problem as such is of no concern to him. He has been yanked from his community of convictions and, regardless of his own wishes, he has been compulsorily thrust into the community of the persecuted. If he is reluctant to admit this to himself, he need only imagine what would ensue if Israel were decisively defeated. Hundreds of thousands of Jews would pour out into the world. Yet again, a Jewish problem of an entirely different order of magnitude would exist, and the signatories of the aforementioned appeal, for all their illusory freedom, might well count themselves lucky just to stay alive. The politically committed Jew who is concerned about the situation in Vietnam and Greece here with hands in his resignation, at least provisionally. He is being replaced by a Jew who has been exposed to the ultimate catastrophe. Will he regain his freedom and be fully able to resume his leftist commitment? This may depend not least on the extent to which he is able to sustain his authenticity in the days that lie ahead.